Our morning began with a tense conversation. Sarah, my wife, mentioned a party that a friend had invited her to. She insisted that she needed to go, that she had promised to support her friend Jess, who had recently gone through a divorce. I understood that it was important to her, but I had my own concerns. "Sarah, it's just a stupid party," I said, trying to speak calmly. "You know how these places always have too much alcohol and too little responsibility." "Jack, I'm a grown man. You can't tell me not to do what I want." Her voice sounded annoyed. "I'm not forbidding you. I'm just saying it's not a good idea, especially now that we're having so many problems in our relationship." Sarah just rolled her eyes, grabbed her purse, and left the room. It was her way of saying the conversation was over. I could feel the anger growing inside of me. We'd been arguing too much lately. But it wasn't just that. I was afraid that our disagreements were starting to destroy what we'd been building for years. When Sarah left, I tried to distract myself. I turned on the TV, started sorting out papers for work, but nothing worked. Every minute I caught myself thinking about her. She wasn't responding to my texts, and that just made it worse. My anger was slowly turning into anxiety. I couldn't stop thinking about what was going on at this party. Who is there? What are they doing? She knew I was against her going, but she did it her way anyway. By midnight, my thoughts began to turn to the darkest scenarios. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that she was just having a good time with her friend. But the inner voice kept telling me that something was wrong. I woke up to a knock on the door. The clock read 6 in the morning. At first, I didn't realize what was going on, but when I opened the door, Sarah was standing in front of me. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup was smeared, and her face was a mixture of guilt and tiredness. "Sarah, what's wrong?" I asked, trying to hide the wave of emotion that came over me. She didn't answer right away, just stood there, her gaze lowered. After a moment, I noticed that her hands were trembling. "Jack, I don't know where to start." Her voice was quiet and broken. "Start with where you've been all night," I replied coldly. Sarah took a deep breath and looked into my eyes. I had made a mistake. I stood in the doorway not knowing what to say. Sarah looked like she was both scared and ashamed. My heart was beating faster, but I kept my cool. "Mistake?" I said the word slowly, as if trying to understand its meaning. "What does that mean, Sarah?" She looked away, her eyes filled with tears. "Jack, I can't explain everything right now. Give me some time to gather my thoughts." "Time? You disappear all night and now you're standing on my doorstep asking for time?" My voice shook, but I didn't yell. Sarah lowered her head. "Please let me come in." I stepped to the side, letting her pass. She walked into the living room and sat on the couch, avoiding my gaze. I closed the door, trying to control my breathing. Anger, resentment, and incomprehension boiled up inside of me. Sarah began to speak after a few minutes of silence. "Jack, I know what this looks like. I understand that you're angry and you have every right to be." "I'm not angry, Sarah. I'm trying to understand what's going on. You left, ignored my texts, came back at 6 a.m., and now you're asking for time. Explain to me what you did." She covered her face with her hands. "It's not what you think it is." "Then tell me what it is." "At the party. It started out like a normal night. Jess and I were talking, drinking wine, listening to music. And then, I felt like I was in the wrong place." "Wrong place?" I frowned. "Yeah, there was this man. He started talking to me, complimenting me. I know how it sounds, but at that moment I was upset about our fights and what?" My words sounded like an icy jab. Sarah struggled to look me in the eye. "I let myself go too far." Those words hit me like thunder. I froze, trying to comprehend what I was hearing. "Too far? Sarah, what do you mean by that?" She turned away. "I don't want to go into details. It was a mistake, and I realize I betrayed your trust." I felt something inside me break. All those years we'd been together, all those moments of happiness seemed to disappear in an instant. "You cheated on me?" I asked, not believing my own words. Sarah didn't answer, but her silence said more than any words could. I stood up, feeling the anger building with each passing moment. "You didn't even try to hide it, did you? You knew it would ruin everything we have, but you did it anyway. Jack, it's not what you think. It was a moment of weakness." "A moment of weakness?" I turned on her abruptly. "Do you realize you just ruined everything?" Sarah started to cry, but her tears didn't make me sympathetic. "Go away," I said, pointing to the door. She stood up, shaking with tears. "Jack, I can't leave like this. We need to talk." "There's nothing more to talk about, Sarah. You've made your choice." The first step toward the abyss. After Sarah left, I was alone. The house was quiet, but inside I was in a storm. I tried to figure out where things had gone wrong, but every time I came back to her words. I sat down on the couch, picked up my phone, and started flipping through our old pictures. They seemed so distant, like they were a life that no longer existed. In that moment, I made one decision for myself. I wasn't going to let this ruin me. If Sarah chose a different path, I would find a way to live without her. I sat in the living room, wrapping my arms around my head. Every minute since Sarah had left seemed like an eternity. There were hundreds of questions swirling around in my head that I couldn't find answers to. Why had she done this? What had gone wrong? We'd always seemed like the perfect couple, hadn't we? I tried to remember our last few months together. We had started arguing more often, it was true. She got annoyed by little things that she hadn't even noticed before. I may have stopped paying enough attention to her too, but did that excuse the betrayal? I got up from the couch and walked to the window. It was getting light outside. The dim morning light flooded the street, making it look like a scene from a movie. Everything looked so calm, like nothing had happened. But inside me, everything was boiling. Memories came flooding back, one after another. I remembered the first time I saw Sarah. She was standing at the counter in the bookstore, leafing through a book she'd never bought, her blonde hair falling to her shoulders, her easy smile. She captured my attention immediately. I found the courage to speak to her, and from that moment our story began. But now it all seemed like an illusion. I remembered how we made our plans, dreamed of the future, how she laughed, how we walked at night holding each other's hands. It all seemed so real, and now it was just emptiness. The memories were replaced by anger. How could she do that? To some stranger at a party I was totally against. She knew I would be against it, but she went anyway. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a spit in the face. I walked over to the table and picked up my phone. My first inclination was to call her, to ask her how she was feeling right now, but I stopped myself. No, that would be too easy for her. She needed to realize that her actions had consequences. A knock on the door snapped me out of my musings. I froze, not immediately realizing what it could be. Could someone have come in this early? I went to the door, and when I opened it, I saw Jess, Sarah's friend, the one she'd gone to the party with. "Jack, can I come in?" she asked, a little nervous. I silently stepped aside, allowing her to enter. "I know you're angry," she began, sitting down on the couch. "Angry? Jess, do you have any idea how I feel right now?" My words sounded harsh. She sighed. "Look, I didn't come here to make excuses for Sarah. I found out for myself after it happened. What are you trying to tell me? That I should forgive her? No, Jack, but I want you to know that she's not a bad person. She just made a mistake." "A mistake? Jess, it's not a mistake, it's a choice." She looked away, not knowing what to say. "You have to decide for yourself what to do next. But I hope you don't make a decision based on anger alone." Jess stood up, preparing to leave. "One more thing, Jack. Sarah loves you. You may not believe it now, but it's true." I stared after her, feeling the two emotions of anger and doubt struggling inside me. Was it possible that she really loved me and still did what she did? Several days passed. Time stretched agonizingly slow, as if each hour was an eternity. I tried to distract myself with things, work, going to the gym, even long walks on the city streets, but none of it worked. Every place, every little thing reminded me of her. In the kitchen, I'd stumbled across her favorite cup. In the bedroom, her perfume still smelled on the bedside table. In the living room lay her plaid that she liked to take when we watched movies. Everything around me screamed that Sarah had been a part of my life, and now that part was gone, leaving behind a void. I avoided any conversations with friends and family. They knew something had happened, but I wasn't ready to share it. I knew questions would be inevitable, but I just didn't want to hear pity or worse, advice. One morning I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, trying to set myself up for a new day. The scenes of our last encounter played over and over in my mind. Her words, her tears, it all seemed so fake. I grabbed my phone and opened the gallery, photos from our trip to Yellowstone. She's laughing, hugging me against the backdrop of a waterfall. We were so happy. Or was I just imagining it? At that moment, my phone rang. Her name popped up on the screen. I stared at it, not knowing what to do. Should I answer it or not? My insides clenched. I hit the reset button and tossed the phone back on the table. A few seconds later, a message came through. "Jack, please give me a chance to explain. I know you're hurting, but we need to talk. It's important." I stared at the screen in silence. Her words seemed meaningless. Does she want to explain? What's there to explain? It's all very clear. The next day I was driving home after work when I saw her car parked outside our house. My heart beat faster, and dozens of thoughts immediately popped into my head. Why is she here? What does she want? I stopped in the driveway, taking my time getting out of the car. She was standing at the door, her eyes darting around like she was looking for something or someone. When she saw me, her face flashed with a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Jack, we need to talk," she said as soon as I got out of the car. "Sarah, I don't know what you want to tell me, but I don't think it's going to make a difference. Please give me at least 5 minutes." Her voice was quiet, almost pleading. I sighed heavily and nodded towards the house. "Come on in." We stepped inside and I gestured her to the couch. She sat down with her hands crossed in her lap like she was afraid she'd break something. "I don't know where to start," she began. "You'd better start with the truth," I said, remaining standing across from her. She lowered her eyes. "You're right. I made a terrible mistake. But it wasn't just a mistake, it was something I can't explain myself." I frowned, not understanding where she was going with this. "After the party, I felt disgusting. I knew that what I did would ruin everything you and I had built." "Then why did you do it, Sarah? Why didn't you stop?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Because I lost myself, Jack. I was so consumed with my resentments, my fears. I sought solace in the wrong place." I remained silent as I listened to her. Her words sounded sincere, but it wasn't enough to dull the pain that was tearing me apart. She continued, "I know you'll probably never forgive me, but I want you to know that I love you. I always have." Those words hit me harder than I expected. I looked away, trying to hide my emotions. "You have? Sarah, love isn't just words, it's an action, and your action destroyed everything we had." She tried to move closer, but I took a step back. "Jack, I need time," I interrupted her. "I can't just let it go." Sarah nodded, wiping away her tears. "I'll wait as long as it takes." The days after her visit dragged by slowly. I tried not to think about her words, but they kept running through my head. She talked about love, about mistakes, about losing herself. But they were all just words. Can words make up for betrayal? Every morning began with emptiness. I got up, mechanically prepared breakfast, got behind the wheel and drove to work. Colleagues noticed that I became withdrawn, but did not ask unnecessary questions. I guess they realized that I didn't need it now. One evening on my way home, I stopped at a bar I used to go to with my friends. I just wanted to sit in a noisy atmosphere surrounded by strangers to forget my worries for a moment. I ordered a whiskey and sat down at a table by the window. Scenes of my and Sarah's life were replaying in my head. Our first vacation, her laughter when I clumsily tried to cook dinner for her birthday, her hug when I got my promotion. It all seemed distant now, almost unreal. At some point, I felt someone sit down next to me. I turned my head and saw Tom, an old friend of mine. "Jack, you haven't returned my calls in a week," he began. "I decided it was time to get you out of this state." "Tom, thanks, but I'd rather be alone right now." "Look, I know this is hard for you, but running away from people is not the answer. You need to talk it out." I looked at him. Maybe he's right. How many times can I keep it all inside? We started talking. Tom was an attentive listener. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He just listened. And as I told him how I felt, for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of relief. "You know, Jack," Tom said when I was done, "sometimes people have to go through pain to realize who they really are. Do you think I should give her a chance? That's something only you can decide, but it's important to realize what you want for yourself." Those words are stuck in my head. What do I want? I want our life back, start over, or do I want to leave it behind and move forward? The next day I decided I needed some clarity. I called Sarah and suggested we meet at the cafe where we first met. She agreed. When I walked in, she was already sitting at a table, looking stressed and tired. "Thanks for coming," she said as soon as I sat down. "I need to figure things out too," I replied. She told me how she had been feeling the last few weeks, about how sorry she was for what she'd done. Her words sounded sincere, but I still had my doubts. "Sarah, I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you." "I understand, Jack, but I'm willing to fight for us, if you give me the slightest chance." We sat for a long time talking about everything that had happened. It wasn't an easy conversation, but maybe it was necessary. On the way home, I felt exhausted, but lighter at the same time. One thing was clear to me. I had a choice in front of me, a choice that could change my life forever. The day after talking to Sarah, I woke up with an anxiety that had settled somewhere deep inside. Her words were sincere, But could sincerity really heal wounds? Could a bridge that had once burned to the ground be rebuilt? Throughout the day, I replayed our conversation more than once in my head. Sarah did try to explain her actions, but to be honest, to me it sounded more like an attempt to justify herself. Nevertheless, there was desperation and pain in her eyes. It made me wonder if she really needed to be given a chance. A few days later, I agreed to another meeting, but this time not in a cafe, but in our house. I wanted to see what it would be like to be around her again, in the space we once shared as a family. When she walked in, tension hung in the room. We were sitting in the living room across from each other, and the silence between us was almost deafening. "Jack, I realize it won't be easy to regain your trust," she began, breaking the silence. "But I want to try. I want us to be a family again." "Sarah, you have to understand one thing," I replied, looking her straight in the eye. "Everything we had is ruined. It can't just be put back together." She nodded as if accepting my answer, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes. We started talking, long and honest. She admitted her mistakes, talked about how confused she was about her feelings and why things had gone wrong. But I still had questions. Why didn't she come to me sooner? Why didn't she tell me what was bothering her? "I was afraid, Jack," she admitted. "I was afraid you wouldn't understand me." The words hit me harder than I'd expected. I'd always thought I was her rock, that she could trust me with anything. But one thing I realized for sure, even if I was part of the problem, her betrayal remains on her conscience. When she left, I was alone in the empty house. I sat in silence for a long time, pondering our conversation. Should I forgive her? Try again? Or put an end to it? The next day, I decided to talk to Ted, our mutual friend who had known us both for years. His outside perspective might help me see the situation more clearly. "Jack, if you want my honest advice," Ted said after hearing my story, "ask yourself one question. Can you live with this? Even if you get back together, will you be able to forget what happened?" His words pierced me like a cold blade. All this month, I had tried to fool myself into believing that I could handle the pain, but now I realized that it was probably beyond me. The next evening, I met up with Sarah again. Her eyes were full of anticipation and her face was full of excitement. "Sarah, I've been thinking for a long time," I began, "but I can't go on living like this. What happened has changed me. It changed us." Her face turned pale. "Are you saying this is the end?" she whispered. "Yes, Sarah, it is the end. I don't want to keep living in the past. I want to move forward." She nodded, though her eyes filled with tears. "I understand, Jack. And despite everything, I'm grateful for everything we had." We said our goodbyes, and this time, for good. It was hard, but at the same time, I felt like I'd made the right choice. Sometimes saying goodbye isn't a defeat. It's the beginning of something new. After our last conversation with Sarah, the house seemed even more quiet and cold. Everything reminded me of the past. The pictures I'd never put away, the small things she'd left behind, the smell of her perfume still lingering in the bedroom. I knew I'd made the right decision, but that didn't make the pain any less. Sometimes I caught myself mentally talking to her, imagining how our lives might have turned out if things had gone differently. But the memories inevitably led to the moment she betrayed my trust, and I felt angry and resentful again. Work became my salvation. I dove headfirst into projects, trying to fill my days to the brim, only to fall exhausted by evening. But even that didn't help completely drown out the thoughts. The evenings were especially difficult. I would sit in the living room looking at the empty couch where we used to spend so much time together and ask myself, why did it have to happen this way? One evening, coming home from a late meeting, I noticed a light in the window of a neighboring house. It was the Gordon family, Julia and Michael with their 2 young children. I could see them eating dinner together, laughing, playing. Their home was full of life and joy. This sight evoked contradictory feelings in me. On the one hand, I was happy for them, but on the other hand, I could not help but envy them. In that moment, I realized that I had been living in the past for too long. It was as if I had frozen my life, afraid to take a step forward. I needed to let go of the pain to find a new happiness, but it was harder than I thought it would be. I decided to tackle the house. Little changes that could help me feel like the place was now completely mine, not our shared territory with Sarah. I took down all the pictures, put away her things, repainted the walls in the living room. These actions became a kind of therapy for me. One day, while going through old boxes in the attic, I came across a diary I had kept years before I met Sarah. I started reading it and discovered what I was then, full of ambition, hopeful, ready for adventure. This person seemed so distant, almost unfamiliar to me. The diary entries inspired me to try to start writing again. I used to always find solace in writing, but in recent years, I had somehow abandoned it. I pulled out my laptop, sat down at my desk, and started just pouring out my thoughts. At first, it was scrappy phrases, incoherent memories, but gradually I began to put them together into stories. Writing became an outlet for me, a way to sort out my feelings. I wrote about pain, betrayal, loss, but also about hope, about the importance of moving forward no matter what. After a few weeks, I began to feel something change inside me. The sadness was still with me, but it no longer dominated. In its place began to emerge a quiet confidence that I could handle it, that my life wasn't over, but just beginning. That's when I got the call from Tom. "Jack, I know you're still recovering, but I have an offer that might interest you," he said. "What kind of offer?" "My company has a new position opening up in another city. It's a great opportunity to start with a clean slate. I thought you might want to consider it." I thought about it. Moving would mean a drastic change, new city, new people, but maybe it was just what I needed. I agreed to Tom's offer. A new job, a new city, a new home, all of these things symbolized the beginning of a new chapter of my life. The move was difficult. I was leaving behind not only memories, but also people who had been a part of my life for years. My coworkers threw a farewell party where many warm words were spoken. It was nice, but I realized that I needed to leave the past behind to make room for the future. The new city greeted me with a noise and rhythm I wasn't used to. Everything was different here. The streets, the people, even the air. At first I felt like a stranger, like I was in a set where I didn't know my role. But gradually I began to integrate into the new life. The job turned out to be exactly the challenge I needed. The projects were demanding and I enjoyed being able to feel needed again. The staff were friendly, and after a couple of months I started to feel like I was becoming part of this team. One of the big moments was the evening I ventured out for a walk in an unfamiliar neighborhood. I walked into a small cafe on the corner of the street, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window. As I watched the passers-by, I caught myself thinking that I felt calm for the first time in a long time. It was at this cafe that I'd met Allison. She was sitting at a nearby table with a book in her hands and glanced at me from time to time. We happened to meet eyes and she smiled. I returned the smile but didn't say anything. A few minutes later, she suddenly approached me. "Sorry to intrude, but you look like you need a break. Am I right?" she asked with a slight smile. I was a little taken aback but answered, "Maybe. And you?" "I was just curious about what you were thinking." That conversation was the beginning of our friendship, and later, something more. Allison was unusual, smart, kind, with a genuine interest in everything I said. She didn't pester me with questions about my past, didn't try to fix me. She was just there, and that was exactly what I needed. A few months passed, and I realized that I no longer looked back with pain. Sarah and everything connected with her were in the past. I did not forget the lessons I had learned, but I no longer let them rule my life. One evening I was sitting at home, reading the manuscript I had been working on for the past weeks. It was a story about a man who had lost everything, but found himself again. This story was about hope, about forgiveness, about the importance of moving forward. I put the manuscript on the table and looked out the window. The city was ablaze with lights, life went on, and I realized that I was ready to be happy again. The past had not disappeared, but it no longer held me in its chains. I was free, and this feeling was the best gift I could give myself.